They told you the law of attraction began with vague whispers of magnetic thought and mental vibrations. And what if I tell you it was shaped and refined through voices that dared to see beyond the ordinary? Voices I will reveal as the hidden architects of a movement that would later ignite Neville Goddard's genius. This is how it unfolds. With early thinkers in the 19th century sowing seeds of metaphysical thought in the soil of Western philosophy and spiritual hunger. This is where the illusion deepens, because what seemed like mystical speculation was in fact a profound attempt to explain the invisible mechanics of reality. This is why it matters, as those early movements in New Thought and Transcendentalist philosophy gave language to something humanity always suspected, that the mind holds creative power. This is the turning point, when writers like Phineas Quimby, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and other mystics framed thought as causation, hinting that inner patterns shape outer life. This is how freedom announces itself, as people realized they were not passive observers, but active participants in the unfolding of events. This is why circumstances lose power, because the emphasis shifted from fate and luck to conscious thought as a magnet for outcomes. This is how destiny is rewritten, when individuals began experimenting with affirmations, visualization, and mental discipline long before Neville. This is where the stage is set, as society slowly prepared for a teacher who would crystallize these ideas into something breathtakingly simple, yet infinitely profound. This is how hidden roots nourish the tree, with each early thinker contributing a piece of the puzzle without yet knowing the picture was incomplete. This is where tension brews, as some rejected these ideas as fantasy, while others clung to them as liberating truth. This is how quiet revolutions begin, not with loud proclamations, but with whispers that echo across generations. This is where philosophy meets practice, as people started using these concepts not as abstract ideals, but as daily tools for healing, prosperity, and transformation. This is why curiosity spreads, because once a seed of possibility is planted, it refuses to die, and it draws more seekers into its orbit. This is how traditions evolve, passing from the mystical salons of New England to spiritual circles worldwide, each retelling strengthening the mythos. This is where preparation happens, for a teacher bold enough to claim that imagination itself, not thought, not willpower, but imagination, creates reality. This is how anticipation builds, with history demanding someone to bridge mysticism and practicality in a way no one else dared. This is why the atmosphere shifted, creating fertile ground for Neville's radical interpretations to take root decades later. This is how the curtain rises, on a stage already humming with expectation, waiting for the man who would step forward and say with authority that your assumption, felt as real, is the law itself. Can you imagine a man stepping into this already fertile landscape, not to echo what others had said, but to shatter boundaries and redefine the very essence of the law of attraction in a way that made it both mystical and practical? This is how the story advances, with Neville Goddard refusing to be boxed in by tradition, daring to say that imagination was not just a tool, but the very fabric of creation. This is where the difference emerges, because unlike other teachers who spoke of attraction as mental magnetism, Neville spoke of assumption as a living law that bends reality itself. This is how the tension grows, for his words unsettled both religious authorities and self-help thinkers by stripping away external power and placing it directly in the hands of the individual. This is why it resonates, as Neville was not just teaching methods, but unveiling a spiritual psychology that declared man and God to be one. This is how clarity takes shape, when his audiences began to see that he was not selling a formula, but guiding them into a radical recognition of their own divinity. This is where the courage lies, because Neville did not fear standing against mainstream religious orthodoxy to insist that the I am within each person was the true creative force. This is how originality speaks, for while others hinted at the power of thought, Neville gave it flesh, blood, and feeling, urging people to live in the state of the wish fulfilled. This is where the stage lights turn, illuminating a man whose presence was both magnetic and challenging, drawing seekers who longed for more than positive thinking cliches. This is how the contrast sharpens, because Neville's vision was not about attracting like a magnet, but about embodying reality as already accomplished. This is why it astonishes, for such a shift transformed the law of attraction from a passive hope into an active, living identity. This is how the weight of his legacy grows, with lectures echoing across time and testimonies of transformation multiplying in ways that defied skepticism. This is where the flame of individuality burns. Because Neville did not align with movements or build an empire, he simply taught, fearlessly, with uncompromising conviction. This is how his message crystallizes, becoming a sharp edge that cut through confusion and lit the path for generations to come. This is where humility and power coexist, for Neville carried his ideas without pomp, letting truth itself bear the authority. This is how influence deepens, as students of mysticism, psychology, and spirituality alike recognize the unique fingerprint he left on the law of attraction. This is where the narrative turns, because Neville's distinctiveness was not only in what he taught, but in the experiential way he demanded his students to test it. This is how the difference is felt, for his legacy was never about belief alone, but about lived evidence through practice. This is where history bows, acknowledging that among many voices, Neville stands apart like a clear bell ringing through fog. This is how his unique place is sealed, not in the margins of mysticism, but at the very heart of what it means to consciously create reality. Picture for a moment a man who stood before his audience and declared with absolute certainty that imagination was not daydreaming or idle fancy, but the very creative core of existence itself. This is how the revelation strikes, because Neville Goddard elevated imagination from a mental pastime to the throne of divine power. This is where perception shifts, as he insisted that what you vividly and emotionally imagine is not fantasy, but the seed of reality pressing to be born. This is how authority sounds when he stated without hesitation that imagination is God, and therefore man, by imagining, is already participating in divine creation. This is why the idea electrifies, because it does not ask for intermediaries, rituals, or external forces, but only for the boldness to assume and feel. This is how simplicity hides profundity, for his method required no props, only the mind entering the state of what it desires. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, as every inner scene, conversation, or visualization takes on the weight of destiny itself. This is how resistance crumbles, because once a person tests this teaching, even with the smallest desire, they discover that imagination leaves fingerprints on the physical world. This is where transformation begins, with individuals moving from powerless hope to creative certainty. This is how Neville broke convention, turning away from affirmations repeated mindlessly, and instead focusing on imaginal acts lived as though they were real. This is why it endures, for people across decades have proven that imagination, when assumed with feeling, calls forth corresponding realities. This is how insight grows, when students begin to understand that imagination is not secondary to life, but the architect of life itself. This is where hidden power awakens, as Neville taught people to see that every world they experience originates first in the theater of their mind. This is how courage arises, because embracing imagination as law requires abandoning the comfort of blaming luck, chance, or circumstance. This is why Neville's words echo, since no one before him had dared to equate imagination so directly with divinity. This is how liberation arrives, when a person realizes they are never trapped, because they can always imagine differently. This is where the shift in teaching crystallizes, as Neville's central idea redefined the law of attraction, not as pulling things toward you, but as assuming their reality already exists within. This is how the atmosphere changes, as those who practice begin to walk with new confidence, carrying unseen realities until they solidify. This is why his vision remains timeless, because imagination will never cease to be the hidden scriptwriter of human life. This is how the central idea of imagination established Neville Goddard as the revolutionary voice who transformed the law of attraction into living truth. Now consider this. Before Neville, much of the law of attraction was framed as the discipline of controlling thoughts, but he raised the bar by declaring that it is not enough to think, you must assume and live in the end. This is how the evolution unfolds, because Neville shifted focus from scattered positive thinking into the concentrated art of embodiment. This is where the breakthrough emerges, For assumption was not about hoping or repeating words, but about entering the felt reality of already being what you seek. This is how the distinction sharpens, because thought may wander, but assumption anchors identity, shaping every reaction, decision, and inner conversation. This is why his teaching pierced deeper, as it demanded immersion rather than surface-level affirmations. This is how Neville redefined effort, moving away from willpower and into effortless dwelling in the state of the wish fulfilled. This is where power lies, because once you assume the end as real, the world organizes itself to reflect it. This is how obstacles dissolve, for the assumption itself carries its own logic, its own invisible bridges, and its own unfolding pathways. This is why he stood apart, insisting that assumption was not pretending, but the recognition of a deeper truth already existing in consciousness. This is how Neville empowered seekers, by teaching them to stop chasing desires and instead rest in the certainty of possession. This is where the shift in psychology occurs, as assumption rewires emotions, thoughts, and expectations to align with the imagined reality. This is how the teaching gains depth, because assumption is not about one isolated act, but about a sustained dwelling in the desired state. This is why resistance fades, as the mind saturated with assumption no longer clings to evidence but trusts inner conviction. This is how Neville clarified manifestation, explaining that thought alone does not create unless it is carried with the weight of assumption. This is where his lectures gained power, as audiences realized they had always been living by assumptions, though often negative ones. This is how awareness sharpens, for the student learns to drop the old identity and wear the new one like a garment until it fits perfectly. This is why Neville's language of living in the end became iconic, because it captured the essence of attraction as identity rather than wishful thought. This is how ordinary life becomes extraordinary, when a person stops waiting and begins dwelling as the one who already has. This is where his brilliance shines, as he transformed the law of attraction into the law of assumption, a law that declared consciousness itself to be destiny. This is how Neville's bold leap from thought to assumption changed the entire trajectory of manifestation teachings forever. Suppose you discover a teacher who could stand with one foot in ancient scripture and the other in the daily struggles of modern existence, weaving the two into a seamless fabric of wisdom. This is how Neville Goddard distinguished himself, for he did not leave the law of attraction floating in the clouds of philosophy, but brought it down into the kitchens, offices, and quiet bedrooms of ordinary people. This is where the alchemy happens. Because he read the Bible not as history, but as a psychological drama, showing listeners that Abraham, Moses, and Jesus were symbols of states of consciousness within themselves. This is how his brilliance took form, when he told audiences that the Red Sea parting was not an external miracle, but the moment a person crossed from doubt into faith. This is why his message resonated, because he made the invisible tangible, turning mysticism into a manual for daily living. This is how the barrier dissolved, with spiritual revelation no longer distant or unreachable, but available in the way one imagines before sleep or speaks inwardly to oneself. This is where he struck gold, because Neville showed that the grand and the ordinary are connected, that the same imagination that created the universe creates a promotion at work or reconciliation in a relationship. This is how authority rang in his words, as people realized that the mystical did not require robes or rituals, but the simple courage to assume. This is why his teaching expanded hearts, because it erased the line between sacred and secular, declaring all life to be imagination expressing itself. This is how Neville redefined prayer, not as pleading to an external God, but as assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled and letting it harden into fact. This is where the practical shines, as students found themselves healing illnesses, solving money troubles, and transforming relationships through what seemed like simple mental exercises. This is how bridges are built, because Neville carried timeless truths into living rooms and lecture halls, equipping ordinary people with extraordinary tools. This is why his influence grew quietly but steadily, because his method worked, and those who tested it could not deny its results. This is how the mystical became approachable, clothed in stories, parables, and direct instructions. This is where liberation entered, as individuals began to see that spirituality was not an escape from life, but a mastery of it. This is how courage spread, because Neville's words gave people permission to believe that their inner world was the true cause of all they experienced. This is why he remains timeless. Because he was never only a mystic, nor merely a practical teacher, he was both, fused in perfect harmony. This is how his legacy continues, showing that the law of attraction thrives most when rooted in spiritual depth and applied with everyday clarity. This is where Neville's genius is undeniable, because he turned mysticism into a living practice that could transform any life willing to imagine boldly. Envision a world where every silent dialogue you hold within yourself is not meaningless chatter, but the very blueprint of the reality you step into. This is how Neville Goddard jolted his audiences awake, by insisting that inner conversations were not private musings but creative acts, shaping destiny. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, because what most dismissed as imagination or daydreaming, Neville declared to be the true script writing of life. This is how the teaching deepens, when he revealed that every inner argument, every secret complaint, and every quiet affirmation eventually appears as outer circumstance. This is why his words carried weight, because he shifted responsibility inward, forcing seekers to confront the stories they told themselves when no one else was listening. This is how transformation begins, as individuals learn to rewrite their self-talk into dialogues that affirm success, love, and abundance. This is where the contrast sharpens, because instead of battling the world outside, Neville taught people to win the war of voices within. This is how liberation feels, when one realizes that choosing different inner conversations is choosing a different future. This is why the idea struck with such force, because it meant there was no wasted thought, no idle word, only seeds planted in the soil of imagination. This is how courage grows, when students recognize they have always been rehearsing futures, whether of despair or triumph, and can now deliberately choose the latter. This is where accountability rises, because the power of creation lies not in blaming circumstance, but in mastering the unseen dialogue. This is how subtlety becomes strength, since no one else may hear these conversations, yet their echoes shape the visible world. This is why Neville's teaching pierced deeply, because he made people realize they were never victims of silence, but creators through every whisper of thought. This is how the practice intensifies, as students learn to engage in inner conversations that are loving, successful, and affirming of their highest desires. This is where invisible becomes inevitable, for once sustained, these imaginal dialogues must find expression in time and space. This is how Neville redefined control, not as manipulating others, but as speaking within as though all were already fulfilled. This is why his teaching endures, because inner conversations are something every human experiences, and thus every human can transform. This is how daily life becomes sacred, for the simplest moment of thought carries infinite creative potential. This is where the law of attraction gained depth, for Neville showed it was not external forces responding to random thoughts, but inner dialogues crystallizing into reality. This is how Neville's revelation about inner conversations continues to echo, turning every quiet moment into a chance to imagine a new destiny. Think of the moment when Neville Goddard stood before his listeners and declared with unwavering certainty that thought alone was not enough, because it is feeling that seals the deal and draws unseen realities into form. This is how the teaching sharpens, as Neville insisted that emotions are the lifeblood of imagination, the vibrational force that gives ideas their weight. This is where his genius shines, because while others spoke vaguely of energy or attraction, he reduced it to the simple truth that feeling is the secret. This is how clarity arrives, when he explained that imagining without feeling is like planting seeds in barren soil. They cannot take root. This is why his words still resound, because every person has felt the difference between a cold idea and a burning conviction carried in the heart. This is how practice deepens, when students learn not only to visualize their desires, but to saturate themselves with the emotions of already having them. This is where resistance weakens, for once the feeling of fulfillment dominates, doubt and fear lose their grip. This is how Neville expanded possibility, urging his followers to feel joy, relief, gratitude, and certainty even before circumstances changed. This is why his method empowers, because it bypasses the intellect, which argues, and goes straight to the heart, which knows. This is how invisible currents move when the world begins to conform to the inner emotional atmosphere held persistently within. This is where transformation takes hold, because once a person learns to generate feeling at will, they gain mastery over creation itself. This is how Neville's message cut through confusion, stripping away complexity and anchoring manifestation in the simplicity of emotion. This is why skeptics faltered, for while they could argue against thoughts shaping reality, they could not deny the power of deep feeling to transform one's outlook and actions. This is how the spiritual merges with the psychological, because feeling not only shifts energy but also rewires behavior, habits, and expectations. This is where boldness arises, for Neville demanded that seekers dare to feel wealthy, loved, or free before they saw evidence of it. This is how paradox becomes power, because pretending turns into reality the moment the feeling is sustained. This is why his phrase endures as a mantra, because feeling is the secret, distills an entire philosophy into 4 unforgettable words. This is how daily life becomes a workshop, as every emotion becomes either a seed of fulfillment or frustration. This is where Neville's brilliance remains unmatched, because he made the law of attraction less about thinking and more about being. This is how the secret of feeling continues to ripple across generations, offering the simplest, yet most profound key to unlocking the creative power within. Ask yourself, what happens when life is not seen as a random sequence of events, but as the outpicturing of invisible states of consciousness that one continuously occupies? This is how Neville Goddard shifted the frame, teaching that people do not manifest what they want, but who they are in their dominant state. This is where the concept gains depth, because a state is not a passing thought, but a full atmosphere of being, complete with feelings, assumptions, and inner dialogues. This is how the teaching broadens, as Neville explained that everyone is already living in a state, whether of lack, abundance, loneliness, or love, and that life reflects whichever state has been assumed. This is why the lesson matters, because it moves manifestation away from random effort and into the deliberate choice of dwelling in a new identity. This is how Neville made it practical, urging his listeners to treat states like clothing, to be worn and changed deliberately until the desired one fits naturally. This is where freedom expands, because realizing states govern reality means that no one is locked into their current experience. They can step into a new one at will. This is how persistence takes shape, for Neville warned that slipping back into old states would inevitably reproduce old patterns, and only sustained assumption brings transformation. This is why his teaching pierced resistance, because it explained why fleeting techniques often fail. People return too quickly to their old states of doubt or fear. This is how the invisible architecture reveals itself, as students notice that their mood, expectations, and self-image align perfectly with what unfolds outside. This is where mastery begins, when a person learns to guard their state as carefully as they guard their health, knowing it is the foundation of everything they experience. This is how the subtle becomes powerful, because even without visible evidence, the inner state quietly reorganizes outer life. This is why Neville's audiences leaned closer, for he gave them not just methods but a map of consciousness itself. This is how identity transforms, as people begin to understand that becoming wealthy, loved, or healthy means stepping into the state of already being so. This is where renewal happens, because states can be revisited, re-entered, and strengthened until they feel permanent. This is how the mundane becomes mystical, as something as simple as how one feels waking up in the morning becomes the seed of destiny. This is why his teaching endures, for it shows that life is not chaotic but perfectly ordered according to the state sustained within. This is how the bridge between imagination and reality is crossed, not by forcing outcomes, but by embodying the state in which those outcomes already exist. This is where Neville's brilliance crystallizes, because he gave seekers the key to unlock any experience. Shift the state, and the world must follow. This is how the power of states of consciousness turn the law of attraction from speculation into a living science of being. Consider the possibility that every event in your life is malleable, capable of being reshaped not by force, but by the deliberate reimagining of past experiences. And this is precisely what Neville Goddard taught through the art of revision. This is how the method unfolds, as he instructed students to revisit memories, both painful and mundane, and reconstruct them in the imagination exactly as they wished they had occurred. This is where empowerment rises, because by changing the inner record of events, the outer circumstances begin to mirror the altered perception. This is how the technique transforms consciousness, turning regret, failure, and disappointment into fertile ground for new manifestations. This is why Neville's approach resonates, as it allows the individual to reclaim agency over history itself, no longer bound by the chains of memory. This is how freedom manifests, because the power to revise grants release from recurring patterns of suffering and limitation. This is where the subtle alchemy happens, as the mind's images, once reimagined vividly and emotionally, send ripples through the present, altering outcomes and opportunities. This is how mastery deepens, as students learn to revisit the day, moments, or conversations and consciously alter them to align with their highest desires. This is why the practice is both practical and mystical, blending psychological insight with spiritual law in a seamless process. This is how Neville's teaching democratizes transformation. For anyone with imagination and discipline can rewrite their past and reshape their future. This is where doubt meets courage, because changing the past in the mind requires boldness to believe in the unseen and unseen consequences. This is how habitual negativity is dismantled, for repeated revision instills the feeling of completion and fulfillment where once there was lack. This is why results appear, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, as reality responds to the new inner script. This is how students gain insight into causality, understanding that the cause resides not in the outer world, but in the unseen imagination that precedes it. This is where Neville's brilliance shows, because he offered a tool for correcting errors, easing grief, and accelerating manifestation all in one practice. This is how hope is restored, for revision makes it clear that the past is not a prison but a canvas awaiting reinterpretation. This is why his audiences embraced the method, experiencing tangible changes and renewed confidence in their creative power. This is how imagination extends its dominion, shaping not just the present and future, but also the very memory of what has been. This is where the technique achieves its magic, as the mind habituates to assume perfection, compelling reality to follow suit. This is how revision solidifies Neville's influence, giving the law of attraction an actionable, repeatable, and profoundly transformative practice. Envision a world where seeing is no longer believing, but feeling and embodying the seen in your imagination becomes the true measure of reality, and this is the distinction Neville Goddard drew between imagination and mere visualization. This is how clarity emerges, because visualization often remains detached, a fleeting mental picture, while imagination is fully immersive, alive with emotion, detail, and conviction. This is where the subtle difference matters, as imagination engages every sense and feeling, transforming the mind into a theater where desires are already real. This is how transformation accelerates, because the law of attraction responds not to pictures alone, but to the depth of experience one carries internally. This is why Neville emphasized embodiment, instructing students to live as though the imagined scene is already a tangible, present fact. This is how empowerment blooms, for imagination allows the individual to rehearse success, love, and abundance with total certainty, creating conditions for manifestation. This is where ordinary methods falter, because visualization without feeling often produces no lasting shift, leaving hope fragile and fleeting. This is how Neville innovates, giving seekers a tool that merges psychological technique with spiritual law into one potent practice. This is why mastery demands repetition, for the more vividly and consistently one imagines, the more the outer world conforms. This is how belief solidifies, as repeated imaginal acts embed themselves into subconscious conviction, quietly directing every choice and perception. This is where imagination becomes sacred, for it is no longer a hobby but a conduit through which reality is drawn. This is how power asserts itself, because imagination, unlike simple mental pictures, carries the energy of lived experience. This is why Neville's audiences were transformed, as they discovered that feeling themselves into the scene was the missing ingredient in every manifestation attempt. This is how the ordinary becomes extraordinary, turning silent mental rehearsal into a creative force that reshapes life. This is where contrast teaches, as those who only visualize often struggle, while those who imagine live their desires internally and watch them materialize externally. This is how the body and mind align, as sensation, emotion, and conviction synchronize to broadcast a unified frequency to the world. This is why imagination is considered divine, because it bridges the gap between the seen and unseen, making the invisible palpable. This is how Neville clarified the law of attraction, by demonstrating that visualization is only a shadow of the real power, which is felt, assumed, and embodied. This is where the threshold of creation lies, at the intersection of imagination and emotion, the place Neville insisted we must inhabit to manifest consciously. This is how his teachings endure, because they transform the act of imagining into a living art that produces measurable, astonishing results. Now consider this. Neville Goddard read the Bible not as a historical record or a moral guide, but as a psychological blueprint revealing the hidden laws that govern consciousness and reality. This is how his interpretation challenges convention, because he claimed that every story, parable, and character is a symbol of inner states and processes, not external events. This is where insight deepens, as Abraham, Moses, and David are understood as aspects of the human imagination, navigating desires, fears, and creative power. This is how meaning shifts, because miracles, battles, and revelations in Scripture are revealed as dramatizations of assumption, attention, and feeling. This is why Neville's framework resonates, because it transforms ancient writings into practical, timeless manuals for manifestation. This is how the ordinary becomes sacred, as students begin to see themselves within biblical narratives, recognizing their own creative capacity mirrored in the stories. This is where authority gains depth, because Neville demonstrated that spiritual texts encode universal principles that anyone can apply, not just priests or mystics. This is how comprehension expands, as understanding Scripture through imagination and feeling illuminates the mechanics of cause and effect in the unseen world. This is why transformation is inevitable, for those who practice the principles find that their outer experiences shift in alignment with the inner script they assume. This is how teaching bridges past and present, connecting the mysticism of ancient texts with the practical needs of modern life. This is where empowerment rises, because students no longer appeal to external forces, but recognize the God within themselves as the true actor of reality. This is how consciousness becomes the stage, and the imagination the actor, reenacting timeless lessons to produce personal miracles. This is why Neville's method is radical, because he claimed the Bible is not about others' history, but our own internal drama waiting to be consciously performed. This is how clarity emerges, as each lecture reframes Scripture into actionable exercises of assumption and feeling. This is where transformation feels immediate, as the unseen becomes perceptible through focused, intentional imagination. This is how faith and psychology merge, showing that belief is not blind, but rooted in repeated, experiential evidence of manifestation. This is why Neville's teachings endure, because they reveal the Bible as a living guide to creative consciousness rather than a set of rules. This is how knowledge becomes power, as the biblical framework teaches students to navigate life with precision, knowing which states to embody and which to discard. This is where subtlety shines, because the interpretation is never literal, but profoundly effective, producing tangible results. This is how Neville's genius reframed spiritual text into a direct manual for mastering the law of attraction, bridging mysticism, psychology, and practical life in one seamless vision. Picture for a moment ordinary people sitting in Neville's lectures, wide-eyed and skeptical, only to leave transformed by witnessing the tangible results of his teachings in the lives of others. This is how credibility takes form, as Neville shared vivid examples of students manifesting love, wealth, health, and reconciliation through the disciplined application of assumption and feeling. This is where the power of demonstration becomes undeniable, Because hearing theory is one thing, but seeing evidence rooted in real human experience creates conviction. This is how hope spreads, as listeners realize that they, too, could reproduce these outcomes in their own lives. This is why his method resonated, because the stories were not sensationalized fantasies, but carefully observed experiences documented by Neville and his students. This is how inspiration ignites, for each testimony serves as a mirror, reflecting what is possible when consciousness aligns with desire. This is where doubt diminishes, because repeated success stories provide proof that the law of attraction is not abstract, but functional and repeatable. This is how learning accelerates, as people internalize the principle that imagination, when combined with feeling and sustained assumption, produces concrete results. This is why transformation feels attainable, because real-life accounts bridge the gap between belief and action. This is how perseverance is encouraged, as even small manifestations build momentum and reinforce trust in the unseen. This is where the psychological mechanism reveals itself, demonstrating that the inner state literally constructs outer reality over time. This is how the ordinary student becomes empowered, as each success story provides a roadmap of methodology and patience. This is why Neville emphasized documentation and reflection, encouraging followers to observe and revise their practice based on actual outcomes. This is how confidence expands, because witnessing evidence instills the certainty necessary to maintain the state of the wish fulfilled. This is where credibility meets mysticism, blending practical validation with spiritual law. This is how collective belief strengthens, as countless testimonies reinforce the idea that manifestation is not luck, but reproducible law. This is why Neville's legacy is enriched, because the real-world applications he provided created a living proof system for his teachings. This is how aspiration turns into practice, showing that imagination, feeling, and assumption are not mere concepts, but actionable tools. This is where the audience becomes a community of experimenters, validating the law of attraction in daily life. This is how Neville solidifies his impact by providing the evidence that bridges theory and transformative experience for all who are willing to act. Think of the countless halls, churches, and small auditoriums where Neville Goddard stood before eager listeners, not with props or scripts, but with a voice that carried authority, clarity, and magnetic conviction. This is how the lecture tradition amplifies influence, because spoken word in the pre-digital era became the primary vessel for transmitting ideas that would later echo across decades. This is where engagement deepens, as Neville did not merely teach abstract theory, but guided audiences through experiential exercises in imagination, feeling, and assumption. This is how transformation takes root, because the immersive nature of his lectures allowed students to feel the shift in consciousness in real time. This is why presence matters, as the energy Neville carried served as both inspiration and subtle calibration of his students' inner states. This is how methods spread organically, with attendees leaving, practicing diligently, and returning with testimony that reinforced the living law of imagination. This is where subtle persuasion occurs, because through storytelling, example, and direct instruction, Neville made the unseen principles of the law of attraction tangible and credible. This is how continuity builds, as repeat lectures allowed the layering of concepts, each session deepening understanding and strengthening practice. This is why immediacy resonates, as students could participate, revise, and embody techniques on the spot under Neville's guidance. This is how empowerment manifests, because witnessing others' responses within the lecture hall reinforced the notion that transformation is not theoretical, but real and attainable. This is where experiential learning shines, as Neville emphasized doing over mere intellectual assent, converting passive listeners into active practitioners. This is how suspense heightens, as exercises like imagining the wish fulfilled left students suspended between inner reality and outer anticipation. This is why influence compounds, for each lecture became a nexus of curiosity, emotional intensity, and actionable guidance. This is how authority radiates, because Neville spoke not from ego or conjecture, but from lived experience and repeated demonstration. This is where tradition intersects with innovation, blending the oral delivery of wisdom with exercises that produced immediate, measurable inner effects. This is how attention anchors, as the focused engagement of each participant created a collective atmosphere conducive to transformation. This is why his teachings endured, as recorded lectures, tapes, and notes preserved the dynamic interplay between instruction and inner experience. This is how mastery spreads, because those who experienced Neville directly often became mentors and guides themselves, propagating the practice further. This is where the living law proves itself, as students leave, apply, and witness results that validate both the teacher and the teachings. This is how the lecture tradition becomes a cornerstone of Neville's legacy, ensuring that the principles of imagination, assumption, and feeling would continue to ripple through generations. Envision a world where ideas travel silently through time, reshaping the minds of those who follow, and Neville Goddard's insights became a lodestar for countless New Thought authors who came after him. This is how influence spreads, as his reinterpretation of imagination and assumption seeded innovations in the teachings of figures like Joseph Murphy, Wayne Dyer, and others exploring manifestation and conscious creation. This is where the subtle power of example manifests, because even when successors do not cite him directly, the core principles of living in the state of the wish fulfilled and feeling the reality first echo Neville's methodology. This is how intellectual lineage emerges, as the emphasis on inner experience, the feeling of the end, and states of consciousness became recurring themes in modern self-help literature. This is why his influence endures, because his reinterpretation of biblical narratives as psychological maps inspired writers to explore metaphysical laws through practical applications. This is how continuity strengthens, as generations of teachers adopted, modified, and expanded Neville's frameworks while retaining their core potency. This is where transformation deepens, because those influenced by him translated mystical, abstract ideas into accessible, replicable practices for their audiences. This is how cultural momentum builds, as Neville's impact is embedded within a broader New Thought movement, quietly shaping millions of lives worldwide. This is why relevance persists, because the principles he championed, assumption, imagination, and feeling, remain central to contemporary law of attraction discourse. This is how his legacy interweaves with modern literature, creating a lineage of thought that emphasizes conscious living as the root of all manifestation. This is where authority migrates, because the clarity and experiential grounding he provided offered a template for other authors to articulate complex metaphysical ideas with simplicity. This is how nuance survives, as each subsequent teacher adapted Neville's approach to address evolving societal needs and psychological understandings. This is why reverence is warranted, for his teachings subtly underpin the methodology and language of countless modern manifestation guides. This is how the invisible thread connects authors, creating a tapestry of influence where Neville's core insights continue to resonate. This is where insight amplifies, because recognizing his contribution clarifies the origins of many techniques now popularized worldwide. This is how subtle shifts compound, as even indirect inspiration carries transformative potential into new texts, lectures, and online content. This is why students benefit today, because studying Neville's work alongside later New Thought authors reveals a lineage of practical, experiential wisdom. This is how philosophy becomes actionable, as his reinterpretations provide the structural backbone for teaching conscious creation. This is where intellectual inheritance solidifies, affirming Neville as a central figure in modern manifestation thought. This is how his influence continues to echo, quietly shaping the law of attraction and New Thought teachings in profound and measurable ways. Picture for a moment the difference between a teacher who shows you the mechanics of desire and one who immerses you in the living experience of fulfillment. And this is precisely where Neville Goddard diverges from the commercialized ideas popularized in The Secret. This is how clarity emerges. Because while The Secret presents attraction as a formula of thoughts and feelings, Neville insists that reality bends only to the sustained state of the wish fulfilled. This is where depth becomes obvious, as he emphasizes identity and assumption over superficial repetition or wishful thinking. This is how nuance matters, because Neville's method is not about wanting or visualizing lightly, but inhabiting the end result until it feels undeniably true. This is why his approach feels radical, as it demands personal responsibility, inner transformation, and disciplined imagination rather than reliance on external laws. This is how the teaching pierces, because he situates creation within consciousness itself, not in abstract universal forces waiting to deliver desires. This is where empowerment rises, for Neville makes it clear that the individual already holds godlike creative power. Nothing outside can grant what consciousness itself generates. This is how subtlety deepens, as the how of manifestation is less about attracting and more about becoming, embodying the desired state until it must manifest. This is why students are transformed, because they no longer chase outcomes, but live as though their desires are already realities, a mindset far removed from popularized attraction techniques. This is how ordinary methods fail, as fleeting visualization and rote affirmations lack the emotional weight and sustained assumption Neville champions. This is where the genius of his distinction lies, because he links feeling, imagination, and identity in a holistic, repeatable framework. This is how credibility solidifies. For those who apply his principles, witness changes that are both profound and consistent, unlike many formulaic teachings. This is why The Secret and similar adaptations, though popular, cannot fully replicate the transformative depth Neville offers. This is how immersion matters, because experiencing the reality internally creates external proof in ways visualization alone cannot. This is where practical application thrives, as Neville provides step-by-step processes like SATs and revision to embed the state of fulfillment into consciousness. This is how impact is magnified, as students learn to recognize that outer conditions are reflections of inner states, not separate forces to be manipulated. This is why his teachings endure with unmatched subtlety, depth, and spiritual resonance. This is how the law of attraction is elevated from a simple technique to an art of conscious creation. This is where identity and desire fuse, revealing that becoming the state you want is the truest manifestation method. This is how Neville Goddard remains distinct, profound, and essential for anyone seeking mastery over reality itself. Ask yourself what happens when a teacher challenges deeply held beliefs about God, reality, and personal power. And this is exactly the terrain Neville Goddard entered, attracting both admiration and skepticism. This is how controversy brews, because his insistence that imagination is God and that each person is responsible for their reality disrupted conventional religious and scientific paradigms. This is where tension grows, as critics labeled his teachings as overly metaphysical, unprovable, or even dangerously individualistic. This is how resilience shines, because Neville never wavered in the face of doubt, standing firmly on experiential evidence and the results of his students. This is why dialogue emerges, for controversy prompted deeper inquiry, forcing audiences to examine their assumptions about authority, miracles, and the nature of consciousness. This is how courage manifests, as embracing Neville's ideas required stepping into personal responsibility rather than attributing power to external forces. This is where misunderstanding often occurs, as many interpreted his spiritual psychology literally rather than metaphorically, missing the deeper psychological and experiential truths. This is how debate sharpens understanding, for skeptics and students alike were pushed to clarify, question, and test the principles themselves. This is why impact persists, because controversy, paradoxically, draws attention and stimulates curiosity in ways quiet acceptance cannot. This is how integrity matters, since Neville relied not on popularity but on demonstrable results and consistent methodology. This is where tension transforms into teaching, as criticism forced him to articulate his philosophy with greater clarity and precision. This is how legacy is tempered, because those who study his work encounter both affirmation and challenge, creating a dynamic learning environment. This is why enduring influence requires bravery, since adopting Neville's methods often meant questioning long-held societal and religious norms. This is how transformation deepens, as confronting skepticism cultivates inner conviction and strengthens imaginative discipline. This is where insight emerges, because the friction of controversy highlights the difference between fleeting belief and authentic, practiced assumption. This is how the unseen is validated, as practitioners observe reality conforming to their inner states despite external doubt. This is why Neville's teachings continue to be debated, studied, and applied long after his lifetime. This is how courage and curiosity intersect, compelling seekers to investigate, experiment, and test the principles for themselves. This is where spiritual and psychological liberation begins, because criticism serves as a crucible for internalizing the law. This is how Neville's philosophy survives and thrives, not because it is universally accepted, but because it is continually tested, proven, and experienced by those bold enough to try. Can you imagine the countless individuals today who, often unknowingly, follow the principles Neville Goddard taught decades ago, applying imagination, feeling, and assumption in daily life to consciously shape their reality? This is how his influence spreads, as YouTube teachers, authors, coaches, and online communities carry forward the essence of his methods to millions of seekers worldwide. This is where adaptation thrives, because modern practitioners translate his lectures into practical exercises, meditations, and digital courses that fit contemporary lifestyles. This is how accessibility grows, as recorded lectures, audiobooks, and social media clips make Neville's teachable to anyone with a curious mind and willing heart. This is why relevance persists, because despite technological and cultural shifts, the core human desire for mastery over one's reality remains unchanged. This is how experimentation flourishes, as practitioners test the law of assumption in relationships, career, health, and finance, documenting results for themselves and others. This is where community forms, as forums, Facebook groups, and online discussion boards create spaces to share experiences, ask questions, and refine understanding collectively. This is how accountability strengthens practice, because seeing the success of others reinforces confidence in the principles and motivates persistence. This is why Neville's teaching feels alive, because each generation of practitioners adds new insights, interpretations, and real-world applications to the original framework. This is how creativity explodes, as individuals craft unique visualizations, guided meditations, and revision exercises inspired by his methods. This is where skepticism meets curiosity, because modern students often start as doubters, yet tangible results convert questioning into conviction. This is how impact multiplies, as social media and digital platforms accelerate the dissemination of his principles far beyond physical lecture halls. This is why ongoing exploration continues, because each practitioner refines the techniques to align with personal experiences, environments, and goals. This is how mastery deepens, as repeated application over time creates not only results but a lived understanding of consciousness as the source of reality. This is where inspiration thrives, because reading or hearing Neville today sparks immediate curiosity and experimentation in countless minds. This is how legacy evolves, shifting from spoken lectures to a digitally immortalized philosophy accessible across the globe. This is why modern teachers often cite him indirectly, carrying forward his principles while adapting the presentation to contemporary culture. This is how the unseen law continues to manifest, as practitioners' inner states reshape outer circumstances in alignment with Neville's teachings. This is where the ripple effect multiplies, because one individual's transformation inspires countless others to experiment and believe. This is how Neville's influence remains dynamic and enduring, proving that his insights into imagination, feeling, and assumption transcend time and medium. Suppose you discover that one of the most overlooked yet potent aspects of Neville Goddard's teachings is the cultivation of an inner atmosphere of gratitude, which acts as a magnet for desired realities. This is how transformation amplifies, because gratitude shifts focus from lack to abundance, reinforcing the assumption that your desires are already fulfilled. This is where emotional alchemy occurs, as feeling genuinely thankful changes the vibrational tone of consciousness and aligns it with what you wish to attract. This is how the subtle becomes tangible, for a mind steeped in gratitude naturally gravitates toward opportunities, people, and experiences that reflect abundance. This is why Neville emphasized daily practice, urging students to mentally rehearse the joy, relief, and satisfaction of having already received what they imagine. This is how empowerment manifests, because gratitude creates a feedback loop. The more you assume and feel, the more reality conforms, which further strengthens inner certainty. This is where ordinary perception transforms, as previously unnoticed blessings become magnified and ordinary events begin to feel extraordinary. This is how inner alignment occurs, because gratitude harmonizes thought, emotion, and assumption into a coherent state of being that cannot fail to manifest. This is why even small shifts matter, for tiny daily acts of appreciation accumulate into a powerful force capable of reshaping outer circumstances. This is how Neville connected feeling with physical manifestation, showing that gratitude is both a state and a catalyst for creative power. This is where subtle resistance fades, because an atmosphere of gratitude leaves little room for doubt, fear, or negative expectation. This is how refinement unfolds, as students learn to consciously replace complaints and worry with appreciation and trust. This is why persistence strengthens results, since repeated practice of gratitude reinforces the desired state and embeds it deeply into consciousness. This is how invisible currents of energy bend to the will of sustained emotional alignment. This is where insight deepens, for gratitude is not merely polite acknowledgement, but a transformative tool that anchors the law of assumption in lived experience. This is how joy becomes a method, as emotional resonance signals the mind and body that the wished-for reality is already present. This is why Neville's teachings remain practical and profound, because they link inner feeling directly to outer creation. This is how mastery grows, when students habitually inhabit gratitude and watch as opportunities, abundance, and fulfillment naturally manifest. This is where life itself becomes a canvas, painted by the emotional states we sustain daily. This is how the atmosphere of gratitude crystallizes Neville's principle, proving that conscious feeling, aligned with imagination, shapes the very fabric of reality. Envision a world where a single teacher's words continue to ripple across generations, quietly shaping the way people understand consciousness, creation, and the law of attraction. And this is Neville Goddard's enduring legacy. This is how influence extends because his lectures, books, and recorded talks remain accessible, inspiring new seekers to explore the art of assumption and the power of imagination. This is where resonance multiplies, as modern authors, coaches, and content creators repeatedly draw from his principles, often without directly naming him, yet carrying forward his insights. This is how wisdom persists, for those who practice his teachings experience transformation, thereby validating the timelessness of his methods. This is why his legacy matters, because Neville's ideas bridge mysticism, psychology, and practical life, offering a path for conscious mastery accessible to anyone willing to assume, feel, and imagine. This is how mentorship extends beyond life, as recordings, transcripts, and digital content allow his voice to guide learners decades after his passing. This is where innovation thrives, because contemporary practitioners reinterpret his techniques for modern contexts, from social media content to online manifestation programs. This is how inspiration perpetuates, as stories of success, inner change, and miraculous results continue to circulate globally, motivating others to explore the law of assumption. This is why his teachings remain relevant, because human desires, struggles, and the quest for mastery are timeless, and Neville offers a direct route to harnessing them. This is how credibility endures, as countless individuals report tangible results through persistent practice of his methods. This is where culture intersects with philosophy, creating a bridge between historical spiritual thought and contemporary personal development movements. This is how curiosity spreads, because learners often dive into Neville's work seeking answers and emerge with a deeper understanding of consciousness and reality. This is why influence is magnified, as each new practitioner potentially inspires others, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of awareness and empowerment. This is how practice reinforces theory, because those who apply his principles verify the law of assumption daily. This is where transformation becomes contagious, as witnessing results in others sparks belief and experimentation in oneself. This is how Neville's voice continues to resonate, teaching that imagination is the true source of creation and that states of consciousness determine destiny. This is why study and practice remain intertwined, ensuring that his work is not just theoretical, but experiential, alive in every application. This is how continuity strengthens, as each new generation discovers, applies, and teaches the principles, expanding the reach of his influence. This is where subtle genius endures, because Neville distilled universal laws into accessible, practical, and emotionally resonant methods. This is how his legacy secures itself, as imagination, assumption, and feeling remain guiding pillars for conscious creation across the globe. Ask yourself what it means for a teaching to transcend time, culture, and technology. And this is precisely what Neville Goddard achieved, creating a body of work that continues to illuminate the principles of conscious creation decades after his lifetime. This is how the essence endures, because imagination, assumption, and feeling are universal faculties, unaffected by era or circumstance, making his guidance eternally relevant. This is where clarity crystallizes, as each principle Neville articulated, living in the end, inner conversation, revision, and the law of assumption, remains applicable to any human desire or challenge. This is how depth sustains, because his teachings do not rely on external validation, but on experiential verification, allowing anyone who applies them to witness results firsthand. This is why the impact is profound, as countless individuals worldwide continue to transform their lives through deliberate imagination and sustained emotional alignment. This is how simplicity gains power, because Neville distilled complex metaphysical truths into principles that are easy to understand, yet infinitely profound in their application. This is where accessibility shines, as books, recorded lectures, and online resources ensure that seekers everywhere can engage with his work. This is how inspiration multiplies, because the tangible results achieved by practitioners perpetuate curiosity and experimentation in others. This is why mastery becomes attainable, for the techniques provide repeatable, practical methods to reshape identity, circumstance, and destiny. This is how alignment asserts itself, as sustained assumption and feeling automatically organize outer reality to reflect inner conviction. This is where subtlety thrives, because transformation is not forced but arises naturally from consistent inner practice. This is how empowerment resonates, since every individual learns that creation resides within, not in luck, circumstance, or external authority. This is why relevance continues, because human desire, longing, and the quest for fulfillment remain unchanged, and Neville offers a method to consciously direct them. This is how continuity persists, as his teachings form a bridge between ancient mystical wisdom and modern psychological insight. This is where freedom flourishes, as students discover that mastery of imagination equals mastery of life itself. This is how resilience is cultivated, because the principles provide tools to navigate challenges, setbacks, and obstacles without losing creative power. This is why the teachings remain magnetic, drawing those willing to commit to inner work and disciplined practice. This is how legacy perpetuates, as each application, experiment, and success becomes a testament to the living law Neville revealed. This is where the timelessness becomes undeniable, for imagination, assumption, and feeling are constants across all eras, human experiences, and cultural contexts. This is how Neville Goddard's work completes its arc, leaving a permanent blueprint for conscious creation, personal empowerment, and the manifestation of desires for generations yet to come.